Before I say another word, before I give you my name or my year or the name of my town, I want to tell you something I read once in a library book that I have never quite been able to set down. In 1788, a woman in England was loaded onto a convict ship bound for Australia. Her crime was listed in the government record, a real document still legible, still held in an archive, as being a nuisance to her husband. Not theft, not violence, a nuisance. She was placed in the ship's hold, and she sailed for 8 months to a country she had never seen, and she never came home. There were tens of thousands of women like her, women transported to Australia across 80 years of this practice for crimes so small they will stop you cold if you are paying attention, for stealing 3 yards of printed cotton, for sleeping in a doorway without permission, for being, in the dry language of a magistrate's record, a person of no fixed abode and a general nuisance to the parish. Their names are in the documents, the muster rolls, the indent records, the ship's logs, and those documents have survived. That is the thing that moves me most every time I come back to this story. They had names, they were particular, they were real. I first read about them on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in a library in Dayton, somewhere in my middle years, and I remember the particular hush of the room and the smell of the books around me and the way the light came through the high windows in long slanted bars. And I remember thinking, these women's lives ran alongside mine without my knowing. They were there the whole time. I had simply not been told. My name is Eleanor. I was born in 1931 in a white-clapboard farmhouse outside Millbrook, Ohio, and tonight I am an old woman sitting in a chair by a lamp, and the night is very quiet. The rain began about an hour ago. Just a light rain, the steady kind that settles in and means to stay. I have a cup of tea that has gone a little cool, and the house is warm, and I find that I am glad to have company. I should mention, someone has told me these evenings of mine are on Spotify now, the whole library of them. The link will be in the description below if you'd like to listen that way, but I'm here regardless, and I'm glad you've come. If you have come here to sleep, please do. You don't have to follow every word, you don't have to remember any of it. I'll sit with the lamp on and tell you 2 stories tonight. One is mine, the ordinary story of a woman born in Ohio in the year 1931 who has lived long enough now to be looking back across almost a century of a particular life. The other belongs to women I never met and never could have met, who lived on the other side of the world 150 years before I was born. I think the two are connected. I think most things in women's lives are connected quietly, underneath, if you look long enough. So, settle yourself. The rain is steady now. I am going to start at the very beginning, which for me means the farmhouse and the land outside it, and the smell of an Ohio winter coming in through the walls. The house was white, or it had been once. By the time I knew it, it was more the colour of old cream, the paint gone soft and lifting at the corners where the weather had worked at it for many winters. It sat back from the road a little, on a slight rise, with 2 oak trees in the front yard that my father claimed were older than the state of Ohio. That may have been true. In January they stood bare and very dark against the sky, their branches making the kind of patterns that look like something from a distance, a face or a map, and dissolve into ordinary wood the closer you get. The house behind them was never grand. It had never been meant to be. 2 stories, 4 rooms, a porch that sagged on the left side and that my father repaired every spring without ever quite fixing it permanently, as if the sagging were something the house itself preferred. Coming in from the cold was the best part of a winter day. You came up the porch steps and pushed through the front door, and the warmth of the house met you all at once. Wood heat from the stove in the kitchen, the smell of whatever was on for supper, the close and particular air of a house that had been sealed against January since November. Your cheeks went from burning cold to burning warm in the space of 3 steps. Your coat smelled of outside air, of cold air and wood smoke and the faint mineral smell of frozen ground. You hung it on the hook by the door, and you were back inside, and inside was the whole world. The kitchen was where we lived. That is not a figure of speech. In winter we moved the chairs from the front room into the kitchen to be nearer the stove, and the kitchen became parlour and dining room and gathering place all at once, the way a kitchen does when heat is a serious matter and not a convenience. The table was oilcloth over wood, a dark red oilcloth with a small pattern of leaves that I could trace with my finger for hours. 4 chairs around it, 1 for each of us, a window over the sink that looked out toward the back field. In winter, that window ran with condensation and you could write your name on it with your finger, and in the morning the letters would still be there, ghostly, before the warmth of the stove burned them away. The smell of that kitchen in winter, this is the thing I reach for first when I try to remember, and the thing that comes back most vividly. Bread baking, not the dramatic moment of coming out of the oven, but the earlier smell, the rising smell, the yeasty warm breath of the dough as it sat in its bowl covered with a clean cloth near the stove, coffee percolating in the old blue pot, wood smoke from the stove itself, and underneath all of it, the older smell of the house, of old wood and whitewash, and the particular settled smell of a place where several generations of the same family have cooked and slept and made their small daily arrangements. That smell has no name that I know of. It is just the smell of home, and I have not found it anywhere else in 90-some years of looking. My mother was always in that kitchen, or so it seems to me now. I know that cannot be quite true. She had a garden in summer, and she went to church, and she drove the 20 minutes into town every other week for things we couldn't grow or make ourselves. But in my memory of winter, she is at the stove. She wore the same few house dresses all season, covered by an apron that tied at the back, and that was always slightly damp because she washed her hands constantly and dried them on it without thinking. She was a quiet woman. Not cold, warmly quiet, the way some people are. The way a room can be warm without making any noise about it. She had strong hands. She could lift a pot of boiling water one-handed and think nothing of it. That competence, that physical, daily, unglamorous competence, is something I have spent my whole life trying to find the right word for. My father was a farmer, which in winter meant something different than in the other seasons. Winter farming was waiting, mostly, with a kind of work threaded through it that required endurance more than skill, keeping the animals fed, keeping the equipment from seizing in the cold, repairing what had broken in the autumn and would be needed again in spring. He was a tall man who had been broad through the shoulders in his youth, and by the time I was old enough to notice him clearly, he was still strong but leaner, the early Depression years having burned away whatever ease he had carried before. He did not talk about those years directly. He talked around them, the way men of his generation did, the way you describe a country by naming its borders rather than its centre. He would say the oats came in low that year. He would say we got through it. The getting through was the whole story, and the rest was not spoken of. His hands told more than his words ever did. They were large hands, calloused on the palms and across the knuckles, with a permanent darkness worked into the creases that no amount of washing completely removed. Farmer's hands, mechanic's hands. I would not have known the difference at 6 years old. He could fix almost anything with them, and he did because in those years you fixed things or you went without. The milk pail with the cracked handle, the window latch that caught, the kitchen chair leg that kept coming loose and that I had been told 50 times not to rock in. He repaired it without comment every time and did not suggest that the chair was partly at fault for being chosen by a child who liked to rock. I think about those women sometimes when I think about my father's hands, not because there is any direct connection, but because hands are what I remember most about the people who shaped me, and the government records of the transported women, those indent documents and muster rolls I have spent time with over the years, speak of the women in terms of their occupations, their physical skills, as if that is the whole of what they were. Lacemaker, servant, laundress, needlewoman, as if a woman were simply what her hands could do. They were always more than that. But the records do not always make room for what the records were not designed to hold, and I find myself reading them, trying to add back what has been taken away. The humour, perhaps. The particular way they laughed, the smell of their kitchens, which no document has ever preserved. We had animals, a cow named Mabel who was neither friendly nor unfriendly but simply bovine in her assessment of the world, 2 pigs that my father referred to with a deliberate vagueness that spared us sentiment about their eventual fate, and chickens that my mother managed with a quiet competence I have mentioned was characteristic of everything she did. The barn was my father's territory, and I was allowed into it but not encouraged to linger. In winter it was warmer than outside, smelling of hay and the great damp breath of the animals, and that smell was so specific to that place and that time that even now, all these decades later, I can conjure it exactly by closing my eyes. Memory is strange that way. Smell is the longest thread, the one that time doesn't easily cut. Ohio in January has a particular quality of light that I have spent years trying to describe accurately and have not managed. Low and white and diffuse when there is snow, coming from everywhere at once so that shadows disappear and the whole landscape flattens into something that is beautiful in an almost abstract way. I noticed it even as a small child, not with words, but with something wordless that I now recognize as the beginning of an aesthetic sense. The white fields stretching past the fence lines, the dark edge of the woods at the back of our property, the sky above it, which in January was never quite blue but a kind of silver white that matched the ground below it, so that the horizon nearly disappeared, and the whole world seemed to be made of one continuous pale material, sky and earth and snow together. My bedroom was at the top of the stairs, the smaller of the two upstairs rooms. I shared it with my sister Ruth, who was 3 years older than me, and who had decided this arrangement entitled her to the window side of the bed, a decree I accepted without much argument and eventually forgot to resent. The room was small enough that you could very nearly touch both walls if you stretched your arms to either side. The bed took up most of it, a chest of drawers that we shared, its top divided into halves by an invisible line that Ruth drew and policed with the authority of the elder, a hook on the back of the door for our Sunday dresses. That was everything that was needed, and therefore everything we had. Cold air came up through the floorboards in winter, a steady seeping cold that no amount of covers fully defeated, and that I accepted the way you accept the facts of a world that presents itself to you as given. We slept pressed together for warmth, Ruth and I, and did not think it unusual. In the morning, the window was furred with frost on the inside, the kind of frost that makes patterns, ferns and feathers, and I liked to look at them before the room warmed enough to melt them. There was a brief period each winter morning when the frost patterns and the light coming through them made the window look like something precious. Like lace, I thought, though I barely knew what lace was then. The quilt on that bed was my grandmother's work, a double wedding ring pattern in blues and greens and a dark red that had faded nearly to rose. She had made it before I was born, and by the time it came to us, the fabrics were soft with age, worn thin in the places that always wore first, the centres of the patches where the needle had gone through most often. My mother had mended it so many times the mending was part of its history now. Most women in that part of Ohio had quilts like it, made by someone's mother or grandmother, put together during the long winter months from scraps of dresses that had worn through at the elbows, shirts that had outlasted their usefulness. Nothing was wasted. The quilt was not sentiment exactly. It was fabric that had been too good to throw away and love, and both of those things at once. Ruth was a serious girl. That is how I would describe her, though I lacked the word for it then. She read more than I did, and she did her schoolwork with a kind of deliberate care that I admired without quite understanding its purpose. She taught me to read before I started school, sitting on the bed with a library primer, pointing at letters with a methodical patience that was entirely characteristic of her. She was not given to easy warmth, not cold, but contained, a person who held things carefully, and I did not know until I was much older how much she loved us all. When I found out, I recognized it as something I had always known without knowing I knew it. That is the kind of thing that sometimes happens with older sisters, I think. The sounds of that house at night, the stove ticking as it cooled through the evening, my parents' voices from the room below, not words, I could never make out words, but the rhythm of conversation, the rise and fall of two people talking who have been talking to each other for years and have found a comfortable way of doing it, an occasional shift of wind in the eaves, once in a while the barn and something from the animals, a low sound from Mabel, or the settling of the chickens which travels farther at night than you would expect, and always the cold outside, which has a sound of its own, a silence so complete it becomes almost audible, pressing against the windows, the cold asking to be let in, and the house quietly declining. I think now about what it means to have a place, not to own it. My parents were tenants on that farm, and they owned very little, but to belong to it in the way that people and land can belong to each other when they have lived together long enough. The sound of that particular wind in those particular eaves, the smell of that particular kitchen in January, those are not general things. They are mine, specific and irreplaceable, and no deed or legal document had anything to do with them. And I think about the women who were put on ships and sent to the other side of the world, away from the sound of their own wind, the smell of their own kitchens, and I think that is a kind of loss I have no adequate word for, not just exile, something more fundamental, the severing of a person from the particular place that helped her know who she was. We woke early. My father was in the barn before the sky had properly committed to being light, and my mother had the stove going and the coffee begun before Ruth and I came downstairs. The mornings had a sequence to them, a particular order that held through the week and through the season, and the holding of it was itself a kind of comfort, the way a repeated song is a comfort partly because you already know how it ends. Oatmeal in winter, with brown sugar when we had it, with a little milk. My father coming in from the barn smelling of cold air and animal warmth, hanging his coat, washing his hands at the kitchen sink. Grace said quickly, my father's voice, and then the morning beginning its ordinary and sufficient business. The land smelled like nothing in winter that it smelled like in any other season, and that is one of the things I know now that I could not have articulated then, that a place is not one thing but many things, cycling through, and to know a place fully, you have to have lived in it across many years and many weathers. My father knew that land the way I now know my own hands. He knew which low corner flooded first in spring and which field held moisture longest in a dry summer. He knew where the groundhogs burrowed along the south fence and where the deer came through the trees in early morning. He had built that knowing over 30 years of continuous attention, and it was not transferable and was not easily replaced. It was his version of belonging to a place. What I learned from that house, from that land, from those January mornings, I have been trying to say it clearly for many years, and I am still not entirely sure I can. Something about endurance. Something about the way the cold comes in and you make do, and the spring comes eventually and then the cold comes again. A patience that is not the same as resignation, but that lives close to it and has to be watched carefully. The women I have read about, the ones on the ships, they had to find that patience in a place that was not theirs, in a landscape entirely unlike any they had known, without the smell of their own kitchen or the sound of their own wind in their own roof. I do not know how they did it, but some of them did. Some of them put down roots in that red, unfamiliar soil and raised families and grew old there and are buried there, and their grandchildren's grandchildren live in Australia now and call it home without any sense of strangeness. That is a kind of endurance that astonishes me even now. But I am getting ahead of myself. We are still in the winter of my early childhood, still in the house outside Millbrook, still in the first years of a decade that was going to ask a great deal of everyone in it. The snow is on the fields, the light is that low Ohio white. My father's hands are wrapped around his coffee cup, and my mother is at the sink, and Ruth is eating her oatmeal with the focused attention she gives to everything, and I am very small, and the world is the kitchen, and the barn, and the lane, and the edge of the woods where the deer come through. Let me stay there a little while longer before the morning asks us to begin. I was 4 years old when the worst of the Depression had settled over Ohio, and 7 when it began to lift, and in those years in between I was too young to understand what was happening but old enough to feel it in the texture of ordinary days. The Depression from inside a child's life is not a headline. It is the particular weight of your mother's face at certain moments. It is the way your father goes quiet at the kitchen table after he has been to the bank or spoken with the landlord. It is the slight calculation in the way your mother serves out supper. Generous to your father, adequate to herself and to you, always with enough left in the pot to offer more if needed, though the offering was rarely taken and she knew it wouldn't be. We did not think of ourselves as poor, or rather, we knew that money was short and that certain things were not possible, and we knew this was true for almost everyone we knew, which made it the condition of life rather than a deprivation. I did not know that children in cities had toys that came from stores wrapped in paper. I did not miss what I had never imagined. What I had was the land and the seasons and Ruth and my parents and the oilcloth table and the quilt on the bed and the freedom to roam the property from fence to fence as long as I was back before supper. And that seemed to me in those years to be a great deal. I'm still not sure I was wrong. What the adults carried that the children didn't, I understood that only later. The worry that I was too young to read in my mother's face, though I could feel it the way children feel things, without words, through the body. The letters that came from the bank, the conversation my parents had that stopped when I came into the room, not because they were hiding something frightening from me, but because the language of it was not for children and they were protecting what they could. My father's particular silence in the evenings of those years, deeper than his ordinary quietness, with something in it that I now recognize as fear. He was afraid of losing the tenancy, of not making the payment, of having nowhere to take his family in a winter that was already cold. My mother made my dresses from flour sacks. This was not unusual. Most of the mothers in our part of Ohio were doing the same, and the flour companies, knowing this, had begun printing their bags in small patterns and soft colours so that the garments made from them would be less obviously what they were. Mine had small blue flowers on a white ground. I loved that dress. I wore it until it was too small, and then my mother took it apart at the seams and used the fabric for something else, a pillowcase, or patches for something that had worn through. And I did not mourn it, because that was simply what happened to things when they were finished being what they were. Nothing completed its usefulness and was then discarded. Everything became something else. Food in those years was simple and sufficient, and my mother could make something from almost nothing in a way I have spent decades trying to replicate without success. A pot of beans that had been soaking since the night before, seasoned with a ham hock that had already flavoured 2 previous pots of something. Bread made twice a week, dense and brown and chewy, that tasted better than any bread I have eaten since, though I cannot tell you exactly why, perhaps because it was made by hands I trusted absolutely, perhaps because I was hungry, in the particular way that children who run all day are hungry. Potatoes in many forms, cornmeal mush in winter, fried in a pan the next morning so the outside was crisp and the inside soft. My mother never once presented food as an ordeal. It was just what we ate, and it was enough, and she made it so. In summer, the garden provided most of what we ate, and what the garden produced in excess my mother canned in glass jars that she lined up in the pantry like a promise. I can still hear the particular sound of those jar lids sealing, a small metallic pop, one at a time, as the glass cooled on the counter. Each pop was a small victory. Each jar on the pantry shelf was a small proof against winter. My mother kept a running count in her head of what was put up and what remained and what needed to be stretched and what would be sufficient. She was a kind of accountant of the ordinary working figures that never appeared on any paper but that she carried accurately and without complaint. The resourcefulness of the women in those years, I did not have a word for it then, but I do now. Heroic is the word I would use, though I am aware it sounds too large for the small scale of it. Not dramatic heroism, not the kind with witnesses or monuments. The quiet daily heroism of making enough from not enough, of keeping children warm and fed and unhaunted by worry when the materials for doing those things were in very short supply. My mother and my Aunt Vera, who lived 4 miles down the road and drove over in the truck every few weeks, and the women at the Methodist church, they traded recipes for stretching things, traded the surplus from their gardens, traded the labour of their hands when something required 2 pairs of them. A quilting bee was not a social occasion, not only, it was warmth being made for winter. Going into town was an event of a particular kind. We went every other week, my father driving and my mother with her list on a folded piece of paper, and Ruth and I in the truck bed when the weather permitted. The main street of Millbrook had a hardware store, a dry goods, a pharmacy with a soda counter that I was allowed to visit perhaps once a season, a post office, and a grocery. The grocery was where I was most aware of money. Watching my mother move through the aisles with her list, making choices that I could see were choices, putting something back, selecting the smaller tin or the generic label. She never made a drama of it. She did the arithmetic with her eyes and moved on, and her face did not change, and I understood even then that not making a drama of it was itself a kind of grace. I found a penny once in the gutter outside the hardware store, and I held it for a long time before showing it to my mother because I already understood, without having been told directly, that a penny was not nothing. She let me keep it. I put it in the small wooden box on my side of the dresser where I kept the other things I had found or been given. A blue glass button, a piece of quartz that sparkled in a particular way when the light caught it, a perfect robin's eggshell I had found under the oak tree and somehow managed to carry home without breaking. The penny went in among them. It was treasure. And the fact that treasure could be 1 cent is a piece of information I have carried usefully through the 90-odd years since. There were people worse off than us, and my parents made sure we knew it without making it a lesson. Families came through looking for work who had nowhere to sleep, men walking the road with a bundle under their arm, looking at the ground, who had ridden the rails from somewhere and were going somewhere and had stopped hoping that somewhere would be better. My father never turned anyone away who came to the back door. He didn't have much to offer, but he offered it. My mother put together a plate, bread, beans, whatever was on, without being asked and without comment, and the man who received it ate it on the porch steps and thanked her quietly and went on. I watched this happen many times. I absorbed the lesson that it was not a lesson. It was just what you did. It was during these years that I first began to understand, without having the words for it yet, that the distance between a woman who was managing and a woman who was in real trouble was often smaller than it looked from the outside. One bad harvest, one illness that cost more than the jar of coins under the bed could cover, one season of drought or flood that turned a year's work into nothing. The women I knew were managing, but they were managing by a margin that required constant attention, and they all knew it, and they held each other carefully because of it. I have thought, since I first read about those transported women, about the narrowness of the line between poverty and what the courts called crime. A woman in England in the 1820s who had no work, no family, and stole a loaf of bread from a baker's window was, in the official record, a thief. But the hunger came before the theft. The record did not ask what brought her to that window. It recorded only what she had taken, and it sentenced her accordingly. For stealing bread, or a piece of cloth, or a single coin, for taking the smallest possible thing out of need or desperation, or sometimes just the compounding bad luck of being poor in the wrong place at the wrong time, a woman could be transported, put on a ship, sent 8 months to the other side of the world to serve out her sentence in a country that was not hers and had not asked for her. There was a woman named Anne Meredith, and she was 23 years old, and she was transported in 1826 for stealing 3 yards of printed cotton from a shop in Bristol. The indent record that listed her particulars when she arrived in Australia noted that she was 5 feet 2 inches tall with brown hair and grey eyes, that she was by trade a housemaid, and that she could read. She was given a 7-year sentence. I have thought about Anne Meredith many times since I first found her name, thought about what she wanted that cotton for, thought about the specific arithmetic of her situation, a dress most likely, something she needed and could not afford. 3 yards of cotton, which is exactly the amount a woman of her height would need for a dress. She was transported for a dress she was going to make herself and wear out. The particularity of it, 3 yards, is the thing that stays with me longest. When I think about the Depression years and what my mother and her neighbours were managing, the careful arithmetic, the doing without, the narrow margin, and then I think about women like Anne Meredith, the connection I feel is not exactly comfort and not exactly sorrow. It is something more like recognition across a wide distance, a sense that the pressures on women's lives have not been so different in their essential shape across so many years, and that the difference between my mother, who managed, and Anne Meredith, who didn't, was partly the difference between a community that could hold you up and a situation in which there was nothing to hold on to. My mother had neighbours. She had my father. She had the church and the garden and the landlord who was at least a known quantity. Anne Meredith may have had none of those things or had them and lost them, and then had to make a calculation with insufficient numbers. But I want to tell you also about the joy of those years, because there was joy, and in my memory it is as vivid as anything else. A summer evening on the porch after supper, the light going golden and long across the fields. My father reading the newspaper aloud when he found something worth hearing. Ruth with her notebook, writing in her small, careful hand for purposes she did not share. My mother's hands finally still in her lap after a day of almost continuous motion, which was itself a kind of event. Those hands resting, the fireflies beginning in the long grass at the edge of the yard, first one, then a handful, then too many to count. I used to lie on my back on the porch boards and look up at the sky through the oak leaves and feel something I now know to call contentment, though I would not have had the word for it then. I only felt it, the way a child feels things, completely and without examination. Christmas in those years was simpler than I think children now would recognize as Christmas. There was a tree. My father cut it from the woods at the back of the property, a cedar usually, fragrant and dense and very green, and we decorated it with things we made from paper and with the small ornaments my mother kept wrapped in tissue from her own childhood, brought out each year like old friends returned. Presents were modest and specific. The year I turned 6, my father made me a wooden box with a sliding lid, sanded smooth and varnished, for the small things I had been keeping in corners and pockets and the crook of the oak tree's lowest branch. He gave it to me at the kitchen table, and I remember the weight of it in my hands, the smell of the fresh varnish, and I thought it was the most beautiful and useful thing I had ever owned. I still have it somewhere. I'm not sure I could say where. What we had that could not be taken. I have thought about this more as I've gotten older, and I think it is the truest thing I know about those depression years. The hard times could take money and security and ease. They could not take the smell of bread baking, or the sound of my parents talking after supper, or the particular quality of an Ohio winter evening when the four of us were in the kitchen together and the stove was going and the cold was outside. Those things were ours in a way that required no deed and no payment. They were simply ours, and we carried them into whatever came next, and they were enough to carry. If you're finding comfort here, stay. I put up a new evening like this each week, and the whole library of them is available on Spotify as well, with a link waiting in the description whenever you'd like it. The depression eased eventually, the way things do. Not with an announcement, not with a clear morning when someone came running to say it was finished. It simply began to loosen by degrees, the way ice in a creek loosens in March before you can quite see it going. By the time I was 8 or 9, something large and new had entered the world and changed what better and worse meant entirely. But that comes a little later. Let me stay here a while longer, in the kitchen, with the beans on the stove and the last of the winter light on the oilcloth, before the world gets larger. School began for me in September of 1937, which was the year the elm tree along the lane lost a major branch to a summer storm, and my father spent 2 Saturdays cutting it into sections and splitting it for firewood, which turned out to be a kind of foreshadowing for the winter that followed. The schoolhouse was 2 miles down the road, a one-room building with a furnace that was either too hot or barely adequate and never quite right, and a smell of chalk and damp wool and the particular industrial cleanliness of a floor that had been swept with oiled sawdust every Friday afternoon for 30 years. I walked to school with Ruth until she went on to the consolidated school in town, and after that I walked with the 3 Miller children from the farm down the lane, who were also 2 of them girls, and therefore also my responsibility on the walk home, whether or not anyone had said so. My teacher in those early years was a woman named Miss Garfield, who was perhaps 35, unmarried, and who had been teaching in that schoolhouse since she was 22. She was not a soft woman. She did not confuse kindness with a relaxation of standards. But she was a fair woman, and she was genuinely interested in what she was doing, which I have since come to understand is not as common a quality in teachers as it should be. She could explain long division 3 different ways if the first 2 hadn't worked, and she would do it without making you feel slow. She had a particular gift for making history feel immediate, as if the past was something happening in an adjacent room if you only put your ear to the wall. It was Miss Garfield who first taught me that documents survive, that what happens is recorded, and that the recording lasts. She showed us the Ohio State records once, a facsimile of early settlement papers, and said something I have never forgotten, that every name on a page was once a person who woke up in the morning with something they needed to do that day. I was 9 years old. I did not know yet what that idea would grow into, the way certain seeds you plant without knowing what they turn out, years later, to be trees. But I felt the weight of it. I felt that names on paper were something more than information. The radio arrived in our house in 1938, and it changed everything. My father bought it second-hand from a man in town who was upgrading to a newer model, a cathedral-style receiver with a wooden cabinet and a dial that lit up amber when the tubes warmed and that we placed on the shelf in the kitchen where it presided over the room like a small altar. We gathered around it for the news and for certain programs in the evenings, and it brought the world into the kitchen in a way that nothing before it had managed. The world had existed before the radio, obviously. We had known this in an abstract way from newspapers and the occasional magazine and from what the adults said. But the radio made the world present. You heard voices. You heard the exact inflection of things. The distance between Millbrook, Ohio, and everything that was not Millbrook, Ohio collapsed into a few feet of air between you and a glowing dial. What I listened to. The Lone Ranger, which was Ruth's great passion and therefore mine by proximity. Jack Benny, whom my father found reliably funny in a way that surprised me because he was not otherwise a man who laughed easily. The evening news, which my parents listened to with a particular quality of attention, heads slightly toward the radio, faces still, that told me the news was serious before I understood enough of it to know why. In the late 1930s, the news was becoming very serious indeed. Names from very far away, Munich, Spain, Manchuria, that meant nothing to me as geography, but that I could hear the weight of in the adult silence after the news was over and before anyone spoke. There were programs for children on Saturday mornings, and I discovered that stories could be told in a different way than I had known, not on a page but in the air, with voices and music and the particular magic of a story that was happening right now, in real time, that you were hearing at the same moment as everyone else in Ohio who had their radio on. Something about that simultaneity struck me as almost miraculous. I thought about this for years, and I still find it difficult to explain the feeling precisely. It was the first time I understood that I was part of something larger than the kitchen and the lane and the school, that there were millions of people out there, and some of them were listening to the same thing I was listening to at this exact moment, and that made us briefly one thing. The summer I was 10, Miss Garfield assigned us a reading project for the school vacation, each student to find a book in the county library on a subject they had not studied before. I chose, from a shelf in the history section, a thin volume called Convict Women of the Australian Colonies, which I selected almost entirely because the words were mysterious and the cover was old. I read it on the porch over 3 evenings, and by the end of the 3rd evening I was sitting in the dark because I had not noticed the light going, and my mother had to call me twice to come in. What I read. There had been a colony in Australia, founded by the British in 1788, built largely on the labour of convicted criminals who were transported from England rather than imprisoned there. Among them were thousands of women. Women convicted of small crimes, theft, vagrancy, what the records called lewd and disorderly conduct, which could mean almost anything a magistrate decided it meant. They were loaded onto ships and sent on an 8-month voyage to the far end of the world, and when they arrived they were assigned as servants or put to work in what were called the female factories, large workhouses where women carded wool and sewed and washed and made themselves useful to the colony that had not asked for them but had received them regardless. I went back to the library the following week and asked the librarian, a Mrs. Pittock, who was accustomed to me by now, if there were any other books on the same subject. She found me 2, and I read those as well, sitting at the library table with the afternoon light coming in through the high windows. I remember the particular pleasure of that, of wanting to know more, of discovering that there was more to know, of finding that the world had been keeping something interesting in a room I hadn't known was there. That feeling has not diminished in all the decades since. It is still the best feeling I know, besides perhaps the feeling of someone you love being glad to see you. What struck me most, at 10 years old, was the names. The books I read reproduced entries from the indent records, the government documents that listed each woman's personal details when she arrived in Australia. Name, age, height, hair and eye colour, complexion, distinguishing marks, trade, ability to read, sentence, and then the crime in the blunt shorthand of the courts, stealing a silk handkerchief, receiving stolen goods, vagrant and disorderly, absconding from service. I read each entry carefully. I tried to make a person out of each set of details: 5 feet 1, brown hair, grey eyes, servant, can read, 7 years. What was the silk handkerchief for? Was she going to sell it? Keep it? Had she never owned anything beautiful and taken it because she couldn't stand it anymore? I asked my father at supper whether he thought it was fair. He was quiet for a moment, in the particular way he had when he was actually considering something rather than preparing a standard answer. Then he said he thought that fair was a word people tended to use when they were the ones who got to decide what was fair, and that the people who made the laws and the people who suffered under them were not always the same people, and that it was worth noticing when they weren't. He went back to his beans after that. My mother said nothing, but I saw something cross her face that I thought was agreement. I was 10 years old, and it was one of the more useful things I had ever heard. The radio brought more history into the kitchen as the 1930s ended. The voice of President Roosevelt, which my parents heard as the voice of someone who understood what they were managing, and which I heard as the voice of someone large and far away who was talking to us directly, which was its own kind of remarkable. The news from Europe getting worse and worse. The names of cities becoming familiar in their wrongness. Cities where people were being hurt, where things were being taken that could not easily be given back. I did not fully understand it, but I understood its shape. I understood that history was happening, and that history was not only in library books, it was on the radio, and it was coming closer. Miss Garfield, in those last years before I outgrew the one-room schoolhouse, taught us about the Civil War, about the Ohio men who had gone to it, and the Ohio women who had stayed and managed farms that needed two people to run. She taught us this, not as triumph or as tragedy, but as fact, as what had happened, which was simply what people did when history arrived and they had no choice but to live inside it. I thought about the women I had read about in the library books. They had not chosen to go to Australia any more than an Ohio farm wife had chosen to send her husband to Virginia to fight. But there they were, inside the history that came for them, managing it the way my mother managed the garden, with steady hands and without much visible complaint. Ruth and I used to argue about the radio. This may sound trivial, but it was in fact a fairly serious disagreement about the nature of things. Ruth believed the radio was telling you about the world as it was. I believed, and I still believe this, that the radio, like any other telling of things, was telling you the world as someone had decided to tell it, and that the people who decided were worth noticing. She thought I was being unnecessarily contrary. I thought she was being insufficiently curious. We were both right, in the way that sisters arguing about something bigger than the thing they're arguing about often are. There was a program on the radio that I loved called The Guiding Light, which was a serial drama about people in a small town making their way through life in ways that were both completely unlike and somehow exactly like the life I was living. I listened to it when I could, on the kitchen radio in the afternoons, while doing whatever the afternoons required, shelling beans, ironing, reading my own book with half my mind. The thing about serial dramas is that they do not resolve. They continue. The story keeps going, and the people keep making their choices, and the consequences of those choices keep arriving, and then the people make more choices in response to the consequences. I found this deeply satisfying. I still do. It is the shape of a real life. By the time I was 12, the world I had been listening to on the radio for 4 years had arrived very much in fact. The war in Europe, which had been a terrible and abstract thing on the other side of an ocean, had become something that involved people I knew, the older brothers of schoolmates, the son of the hardware store owner, a young man from the Methodist church named Thomas Hale who had a voice like good wood and who went away in the spring of 1942 and did not come back. That is coming in the next part of my story. I want to stay here a little longer, in the years before, in the kitchen with the radio glowing and the world being large and interesting and not yet asking anything in particular of any of us. I think the most useful thing the radio taught me, more useful in a way than anything the school taught me, was that the world was full of people with particular lives, and that all those lives were happening simultaneously right now, and that what connected them was something fragile and worth attending to. The women I kept returning to in my reading, the Anne Merediths and the others, the women with their grey eyes and their 3 yards of cotton, they had been having their particular lives at the same time that other lives were being had all around them, and no one had put them together into one picture until someone, much later, decided to go looking. I decided, somewhere around 12 years old, that I wanted to be the kind of person who went looking. But there was supper to start, and there was Ruth home from the consolidated school in town with her notebooks and her opinions, and there was my father coming in from the barn smelling of the November afternoon, and the radio was playing something soft and faintly cheerful in the kitchen corner. Let the evening settle around us. The world could be large tomorrow. The announcement came on a Sunday in December, which is a fact everyone who was alive and old enough to receive it remembers. I was 11 by then. My birthday had come in October, and we were at home when the news came over the radio, and my parents sat very still and listened to it the way people sit still when something large and irrevocable has just occurred and the body knows before the mind has finished with the information. My father said something short and quiet. My mother said nothing at all. And then the ordinary things of the afternoon resumed, because ordinary things resume, they always do, and that resumption is itself a kind of answer to the large and irrevocable things. The war reorganized everything. The farm, which had already been reorganizing itself through the slow recovery of the late 1930s, reorganized again. Prices changed. What you could get and what you couldn't changed. The men in the neighborhood began going, one by one, in the way that single trees going from a wood makes the remaining trees look suddenly exposed, the gaps between them visible for the first time. My father was 37 when Pearl Harbor was bombed and had a farm tenancy and 2 dependents and a partial deafness in one ear from a childhood illness, and he was not taken. I watched him understand this. standing at the kitchen table the morning after the announcement, very still, with what I thought then was relief, and now understand was something more complicated than that. My cousin Franklin went in the spring of 1942. He was my father's sister's boy, 19 years old, with red hair that embarrassed him and a laugh that did not embarrass anyone. He had come to the farm every summer of my childhood, and he and Ruth and I had spent those summers in a state of benign, productive conflict about who would get the good fishing spot, about whether the rope swing over the creek was safe enough to use the way Franklin wanted to use it, about the rules of whatever game we had invented that afternoon, the rules of which were always disputed. He was one of those people who seemed to light up the space around them without intending to. When Franklin went away, the summers got quieter. Rationing began in the spring of 1942 and continued until the war was over. Sugar first, then coffee, then meat, then shoes. You received your ration book and you managed what you were given, which for most of the women I knew was not so different from what they had been doing since the Depression. Managing what you had, stretching what needed stretching, finding pleasure in ingenuity. My mother's victory garden expanded significantly. She grew more beans, more squash, more potatoes. She traded surplus tomatoes with Vera for surplus sweet corn. She made do so well and so quietly that the making do became invisible, which is perhaps the highest form of it. The victory gardens were everywhere that summer and the summers after. Every available patch of ground in Ohio, it seemed, had been converted to vegetables. The railway stations had gardens along their platforms. The county fairgrounds had demonstration plots. Church ladies grew tomatoes along the south walls of parish halls. My mother, who had been gardening seriously for 20 years, became a quiet authority on the subject and was consulted regularly by women who were gardening for the first time and were alarmed by how complex a thing it turned out to be. She advised without condescension. She gave starts from her own seedlings. She was the kind of neighbor who understood that her abundance was partly luck and therefore partly owed. Women were doing new things in those years, taking on jobs that had been men's jobs in the factories and the offices and the farms. This was talked about as a wartime necessity and a temporary arrangement, and most people, including most women, seemed to accept this framing without much examination. But I watched it happen, and what I saw was women discovering, with varying degrees of surprise and satisfaction, that they could do most things that had been kept from them not because they lacked the ability, but because no one had given them the occasion. I was 12 and 13 and 14 in those years, and I was watching and absorbing, and what I was absorbing was a picture of what women's lives could contain that was different from what I had assumed. The letters from Franklin came every few weeks, then less regularly, then sometimes with long gaps that had their own particular weight. My aunt kept us informed of what he wrote, not the contents exactly, which were censored in parts and edited by Franklin himself, in other parts for his mother's benefit, but the fact of the letters arriving, the fact of his continuing. He was in the Pacific. He was in the Navy. He was, as far as anyone could tell from what he was permitted to write, alive and managing. His letters had a quality of compression to them that I have thought about many times since, the sense of a large amount of experience that could not be said, pressing against the edges of the small amount that could. Every sentence that made it through the censor's pen carried the weight of the sentences that didn't. My mother waited for news of Franklin, as she waited for all the news from wherever the men in our community had gone, with a patience that was not passive. She prayed, though not ostentatiously. She did her regular work, because the work needed doing regardless. She talked about Franklin with my aunt when they were together, in the particular way women talk about the people they love when those people are in danger. Not dramatizing, not suppressing, just holding the worry in conversation, keeping it from becoming something too large to carry by sharing it between them. That is what women have always known how to do, I think. Hold things together in conversation, keep the weight distributed. I have thought often, in the years since, about the women who had been transported to Australia and who waited for letters that largely did not come. They were separated from their families by an ocean and a government sentence, and there was no organized system for keeping in touch. A woman transported to Australia in 1826 might not see or hear from her family again, ever. The letter that arrived, if one arrived, had travelled months to reach her. The letter she wrote, if she could write, travelled months back. By the time any correspondence completed its circuit, the circumstances it had been written about might be entirely different. Someone might be dead, or married, or moved, and the letter was arriving into a situation that had changed before it even departed. That gap between the sending and the receiving, between the asking and the answering, seems to me one of the cruelest aspects of transportation as a punishment. It was not just separation. It was a kind of enforced, permanent outdatedness. You were always behind. You were always receiving yesterday. What the women who waited had in common with the transported women is something I have turned over many times without quite being able to name it. Both groups were waiting for news of someone they loved, news that was slow and incomplete and sometimes didn't come at all. Both groups were managing the ordinary work of life in the gap between the sending and the arriving, keeping things going without knowing what was happening elsewhere, making decisions with insufficient information, getting through the days. Getting through the days is what women have always done when the larger story they are part of is being decided somewhere they cannot see. It is not a small accomplishment. It requires a great deal, and it leaves very few marks in the historical record. The summer of 1943, I turned 12 and then 13 in what felt like a very short autumn, and I went to the consolidated high school in town for the first time, taking the bus with Ruth, who was now a junior, and who navigated the social arrangements of the school with the same calm competence she brought to everything. I found the new school large and loud and absorbing, and I found, for the first time, that not every teacher was Miss Garfield, that some teachers taught because they needed a position and had chosen teaching over other available positions, and that this produced a particular quality of inattention in the teaching that I found frustrating. But there were good ones too, and the library was larger, and I spent a portion of every lunch period in it that I could manage. My father, in those war years, was quieter than usual, which was saying something since he was already a quiet man. He did the work of the farm. He listened to the radio news. He sat on the porch in the evenings and looked out at the fields with an expression that I could not read as a child, and that I now think was a kind of sustained moral discomfort at not going, at being the one who stayed while younger men went. He helped his neighbours with extra labour when they needed it. He contributed to the bond drives. He did what he could, which was not what he thought he should, and the gap between those two things sat in him quietly for 4 years. My mother, meanwhile, kept the household running with the steady, unheroic heroism I have already described and will not belabour. She did add one thing to her routine in those years. She began corresponding with 3 women whose sons or husbands were overseas, women she knew from church or the county women's group, writing letters that went out and received letters in return, a small network of mutual accounting that I think helped her and that I think helped them. She had always been somewhat contained, my mother, inward, in a way that was not unfriendly, but was somewhat private, and I was struck by the fact that the war expanded her social connections rather than contracting them. Perhaps necessity does that. Perhaps the shared anxiety created a permission she hadn't previously given herself to reach toward other people. Franklin came home in 1946, thin and very quiet in a way that was different from my father's quietness. He came for Sunday dinner at our house in the summer of that year, and I remember sitting across the table from him and thinking that he was both exactly Franklin and also someone who had been somewhere the rest of us had not, and that the somewhere had left its marks in a way he was not yet ready to talk about and perhaps never would be. He ate my mother's pot roast with genuine pleasure. He laughed twice in a way that was recognizably his laugh. He asked about the farm and the garden and the school bus route. He was still in there, Franklin, inside the quietness. But the quietness was now an outer layer that hadn't been there before. We did not talk about what he had seen. This was normal for that time and that place. The returning men did not generally talk and were not generally asked. Whether this was the right arrangement, I have gone back and forth on many times. There is an argument for letting men carry their own silences rather than requiring them to perform their wounds for the relief of those who did not share them. There is also an argument that the silence was a damage in itself, a wound that sealed over without healing. I think both arguments are true, and I think they were both true of Franklin, who lived a long and mostly peaceful life in Ohio after the war, and who carried something behind his eyes for the rest of it that he never put into words. The war ended in the summer of 1945, when I was 14. The announcement came over the radio on a Tuesday, and this time the adults in the kitchen did not sit still. My father laughed, a sound I did not hear often, full and unguarded. My mother cried briefly, turning toward the window so we wouldn't see it, which we saw anyway. The church bells in Millbrook rang, which I heard from the farm, a sound coming from miles away across the fields in the late afternoon, small and clear and unbelievably welcome. And then the ordinary things of the afternoon resumed, and this time the resumption felt like gratitude rather than endurance. Sleep if you're feeling it. I'll be here, going forward in the story whenever you're ready. I had known Harold since I was 9 years old, which is to say I had known him in the vague adjacency that small towns produce. He was a year ahead of me in school. I had some awareness of him as a physical fact in the landscape. He was the kind of presence you register without looking directly at. He was not remarkable in any particularly obvious way. Medium height, brown hair worn short in the fashion of the time, a tendency towards silence in groups that I initially read as shyness and later understood was something different. A preference, really, for listening rather than performing, which I have come to think is a quality more rare and more useful than it appears. He went into the army in 1945, right at the end of the war, which meant he spent his service time in occupied Germany rather than in combat. He saw things there, the aftermath of things, the wreckage of things, that he spoke about even less than the combat veterans spoke about their experiences. The aftermath, I have since learned, can be harder in certain ways than the active event. You are standing in what is left after the story, and the story is no longer happening, and what is left is just the fact of what was done. Harold carried that with him. It showed in the careful way he spoke about Europe, the way he would begin a sentence and then close it again before arriving where it was going. He came home to Millbrook in 1947, and by that time I was 16 and no longer vague about much. I noticed him again at a church social in September of that year, a picnic, late summer heat still in the air, tables set up on the church lawn, and the women from the ladies' auxiliary moving between them with platters of things. He was standing near the fence by himself, holding a glass of lemonade and looking at the field across the road, and something about the quality of his looking. Not absent, exactly, but very specifically present in a way that didn't require a social occasion to justify it, caught my attention in a way it had not before. We talked. I do not remember the content of the first conversation, except that it was about the farm and the war and the summer heat, all the ordinary surface things, and that what I was noticing was not the content but something underneath it, the quality of his attention, the way he listened to what you said before answering. The way his answers were honest in a way that was somewhat unusual for social occasions. I had been taught that social conversation was a kind of performance, an exchange of pleasantries that moved along a track, and Harold seemed not quite aware of the track. He said what he thought in measured and careful language and waited for you to respond to what he'd actually said rather than to what was expected. It was both refreshing and slightly disconcerting. We courted for 2 years in the way that was customary then, meaning in the presence of other people, in public settings, with the implicit understanding on the part of everyone who knew us that we were heading somewhere without any requirement for the destination to be stated aloud. He came to Sunday dinners at our farm. We went to the pictures in town, twice a month if the car was working, once a month if it wasn't. We went to dances at the Grange Hall, where Harold danced without particular talent, but with a good-natured willingness that I found appealing. My parents approved of him, which mattered to me more than I might have admitted at the time. My father said he was a steady man, which was high praise from my father. We were married in June of 1951 at the Methodist Church in Millbrook on a morning that was already hot by 10 o'clock, the kind of Ohio June that promises a hard summer. My dress was white lawn, made by my mother and by Vera, who between them had the relevant skills and had allocated 2 Saturdays to the project. The reception was in the church hall. Potato salad, cold fried chicken, lemonade, a cake that Vera's sister had baked in 3 layers. My aunt cried. Franklin laughed and was louder than usual, which was his version of joy. My father shook Harold's hand for a long time before releasing it. My mother kissed my cheek and said quietly, into my ear, "Be patient with each other." That was her entire advice. It has turned out to be entirely sufficient. What marriage meant in 1951, in Millbrook, Ohio, in the life I was entering, I want to be precise about this because I think precision is important here, and I think the truth is neither as bad as it looks from the outside of that time nor as simple as the people who lived inside it sometimes pretended. When I married Harold, I signed a legal arrangement that in most respects made his life primary and mine secondary. His name went on the mortgage when we eventually got a mortgage. His credit was the credit. His income was the income because mine was not going to continue in the same way once children came, which was assumed by everyone including me, which was simply how things were organized in that particular time and place. I am stating this not as complaint but as fact, because facts are worth knowing. And yet within that structure, within those arrangements that would look from the outside like constraint, there was a genuine life that was genuinely mine. Harold did not treat me as a subordinate. He treated me, within the private space of our marriage, as a person whose opinions mattered and whose preferences counted and whose intelligence was something he took seriously and valued. This was not universal among the marriages I observed around me, and I was aware enough, even then, to know it was not guaranteed. Some women I knew were in marriages that were more obviously the structures they were legally designed to be. Harold was not that kind of man. Whatever the law said about our arrangement, and the law said quite a lot, he behaved in our house as if I were his equal, and perhaps that is the only thing that matters in the end, what actually happens inside the house, where the law is not looking. I have thought about this in relation to those transported women many times over the years. The phrase that appears in some of the records, being a nuisance to her husband, has interested me enormously, precisely because it raises a question no record I have found answers. What was she doing that he found a nuisance? Was she angry? Was she refusing something? Was she speaking when he expected silence, or laughing when he expected gravity, or simply existing in a way that took up more space than he had allocated for her? The phrase tells us what the husband said. It does not tell us what the woman was doing or why. She was a nuisance. That is all we know. The fact that being a nuisance to one's husband could result in a woman being put on a ship and sent to Australia tells you something about how the law understood the domestic arrangement. It understood it as his. What would have made me a nuisance to a husband who was inclined to see it that way? I asked myself this, not in those early years of marriage when I was too busy and too invested to examine the structures I was inside, but later when I had the luxury and the perspective that comes with time. I asked myself what behavior of mine, in another arrangement, in another marriage, would have crossed from acceptable to troublesome. The opinions I expressed when Harold and I disagreed. The books I kept reading when the house was only somewhat tidy. The persistence with which I went back to certain arguments I thought had been closed before they were actually resolved. In my marriage, these things were tolerated and often welcomed. In a different marriage, with a different man, in a somewhat different social climate, they might have been named and used against me. The naming and using would not have required much effort. The vocabulary was already there. In the early years of our marriage, we lived in a rented house in Millbrook, 2 bedrooms, a good kitchen, a yard that backed up to a neighbour's yard across a low wire fence. Harold worked at the mill on the edge of town, a paper mill that was the main employer for that part of the county, and I did what women in new marriages did in those years. I kept the house, managed the food and the cleaning and the social arrangements, learned the routines of a shared life, learned the texture of another person at close quarters in a way that courtship, even careful courtship, does not quite prepare you for. There is a particular education in learning to live with someone, not their habits. You expect to discover habits, but their interior weather, the moods that come from nowhere and the moods that come from somewhere specific, the things that settle them and the things that disturb them. Harold was, as I have said, a steady man, but steady men have their weather too, and his came in the form of occasional periods of withdrawal, of going quiet in a different way than his natural quietness, of being present in the body but somewhere else in the mind. I learned gradually to neither take it personally nor pretend it wasn't happening. I learned to be near enough to be found if he wanted to come back without requiring him to come back on a schedule. In return, he learned me. He learned that I was not a naturally patient person, that what looked like patience was often calculated forbearance, and that it had limits, and that those limits were worth knowing. He learned that I thought better when I could talk through what I was thinking, and that thinking aloud was not the same as having decided something. He learned that I was most myself in the morning and least myself in the late afternoon, and that supper was a bad time for serious conversations. He learned these things without my telling him most of them, because he was paying attention, which is the foundation of everything in a long marriage. You pay attention and you use what you learn, and you extend the same courtesy in return. The first year of a marriage has a particular quality that is different from every year that follows, a kind of heightened reality, as if everything is still slightly new and therefore slightly more visible than it will be once it becomes ordinary. I remember that year in detail that later years don't have. The specific quality of the light in the kitchen of that house in winter. The particular smell of Harold's coat when he came in from the mill in December. The sound of the radiator in the bedroom at night. The way the yard looked with the first snow. All of it was brand new and therefore vivid, and I absorbed it the way I had absorbed the kitchen in my parents' house as a child, into the body, into the part of memory that is not accessible by thinking, but only by smell or sound or the particular quality of winterlight on a white wall. The women who had been transported, the ones who were assigned as domestic servants when they arrived in Australia, I wonder sometimes what their first years in that new arrangement were like, inside all the obvious hardship of it. What they noticed, the smell of eucalyptus, which is nothing like any English tree, the reversed seasons, Christmas in summer, June as the beginning of winter, the strange quality of southern hemisphere light which people who know it say is different from northern light in a way that is difficult to describe but immediately perceptible. They were in someone else's house, serving someone else's domestic arrangements, in a country that was not theirs, and they were doing the ordinary things, the cleaning, the cooking, the carrying of water, in a landscape that was entirely unfamiliar. What kept them going, I have often wondered? What small thing, what detail of the daily life allowed them to be present in the day rather than perpetually overwhelmed by the distance between where they were and where they had been? Harold and I were happy in that first house. I say it simply because it is simple and because simple true things deserve to be said simply. We were young and we were making something, and the making of it was absorbing and interesting and occasionally frustrating and sometimes funny. We argued about where to put the furniture and whether the kitchen curtains were too dark and how often to have his mother over for Sunday dinner. We argued the way two people argue who are taking each other seriously enough to disagree honestly, which is the only kind of argument that is worth the effort. And then we went to bed and woke up the next morning and made coffee and began again, because that is what marriage is in its essential structure. Beginning again. Doing that for many years in a row. The lamp by the bed casts a particular light at this hour. I notice it every night, the way it makes the ceiling look like something old. Let me rest there a moment before I go on. The house is very quiet, and outside the rain has found its rhythm now, and it will keep that rhythm all night, I think. There is a comfort in a thing that keeps on steadily without asking anything of you. Our daughter was born in 1954 in June on a morning that was already warm when we got to the county hospital at 4 in the morning and warm in a different, fuller way when we came back out with her 12 hours later. I have never been particularly good at describing what it is to hold a child for the first time, my own child the first time, except to say that the world rearranges itself around that event and does not go back to its previous arrangement afterward. You are not the same person on the other side of it. The reorganization is total and permanent, and you consent to it completely, which is the most extraordinary thing about it, the complete and immediate consent. We named her Margaret after Harold's mother, which was Harold's idea and one I liked. She was a round, solemn baby who looked in those first weeks as if she were working out a complex problem and preferred not to be disturbed while she was doing it. Our son was born in 1957, in November, which was a harder season for a birth, the hospital cold and the drive there in the dark along icy roads, with Harold saying nothing and driving carefully and me saying nothing and being grateful for the care. We named him Thomas, after no one in particular, simply because we liked the name. He was different from Margaret in every way a baby can be different, loud where she had been quiet, impatient where she had been methodical, convinced from birth that the world was not moving fast enough. He remains, at his current age, a man who thinks the world is not moving fast enough, so the continuity has held. We were living by then in a small house on Maple Street in Millbrook, which Harold had bought on a mortgage that required careful management for the first several years. 3 bedrooms, a kitchen that was adequate but that I made better with a coat of paint, and the removal of a cabinet that had been poorly placed and was blocking the window, a living room large enough for a sofa and 2 chairs, and the television that arrived in our house in 1955, which was a large and formal event. The delivery of the set, the placement of it, the first evening sitting in front of it, the sensation of having the world delivered into the living room in moving pictures. Margaret sat on the floor in front of it and watched whatever was on with an expression of pure absorption that I still find funny to remember. The domestic life of those years, I want to describe it honestly, which means neither romanticizing it nor diminishing it. It was repetitive, it was full, it had a rhythm that was partly beautiful and partly grinding, and which part it felt like on any given day depended on the day. The laundry on Monday, the ironing on Tuesday, the marketing on Wednesday, the deep cleaning on Thursday, Friday's baking, the weekend for whatever the weekend brought. This schedule was not imposed on me from outside. It was, in the way that most things are, something I had largely organized myself, having absorbed the rhythms of my mother's house and adapted them to my own situation. It was my schedule. Within it, I had very little time that was unallocated to someone else's needs, but the structure of it gave me a kind of operational freedom that I found I preferred to less organized arrangements. I loved the baking most. Friday afternoons, when the children were home from school and doing their homework at the kitchen table, and the house smelled of bread and something sweet I had made alongside it, a coffee cake, often, or a pie if the fruit was right. There is something about baking that has always seemed to me to be simultaneously practical and extravagant. You take plain things, flour, butter, sugar, thyme, and you make something that is more than the sum of them, something that involves your hands and your attention, and your specific knowledge of your own oven and its moods. And then you give it away, or eat it with the people you love, and it is gone, and you begin again next Friday. Nothing is wasted. Everything is used up in the best way. Margaret at 7 was a reader, like Ruth, with Ruth's same contained seriousness and Ruth's same reluctance to be interrupted when absorbed. She read at the kitchen table while the laundry dried on the line outside and while I was making supper and while Thomas was making whatever noise Thomas was making at any given moment. She read with a piece of her mother's self-discipline that I recognized and that I thought was one of the better things she could have inherited from me, even if it sometimes made her seem farther away than she was. Tom was a runner, a climber, a taker apart of things that he could not always put back together, a boy who arrived in every room as if he had just come from somewhere more exciting and was about to leave for somewhere else. I loved them both unreasonably and completely, in the way you love your children, which is not the way you love anything else. The neighborhood on Maple Street was made of young families, all of us in roughly the same stage of life, all of us managing roughly the same tasks with roughly the same resources. The women on our block knew each other's business to the extent that proximity and shared purpose creates knowing, which is considerably. We borrowed cups of sugar without ceremony. We watched each other's children when circumstances required it. We appeared at each other's doors with food when there had been an illness or a death. We walked to the market together sometimes, or sat on each other's back steps in the summer while the children played in the yards and talked the ordinary talk of women whose lives are full of immediate practical concerns and who find, in talking about those concerns, a relief from the isolation that can settle over you when you are inside a life that is mostly domestic. Harold's mother, Margaret Sr., used to come on Sundays and sit at our kitchen table and tell me things she thought I should know about her son and about life in general, and I have to say that on balance her advice was less unwelcome than I initially received it. She told me that a marriage required maintenance in the way that a house required maintenance, that the things that seemed solid were only solid because someone had been paying attention to them, and that a neglected marriage, like a neglected house, developed small problems that became large ones if not addressed. She said this to me the second year of my marriage, when I was 22 years old and thought I understood most of what I needed to understand, and I received it with a politeness that contained rather less genuine reception than it should have. It took me another 20 years to fully understand what she meant, and by then she was gone, and I couldn't tell her she had been right. There was a Tuesday in October of 1959 that I have never forgotten, though nothing in particular happened in it. Margaret was 5, Tom was 2, Harold was at work. It was a clear, cool day, the kind of October day that Ohio does better than most places. The light sharp and golden, the air with that particular autumn edge that is cold enough to notice without being cold enough to require more than a jacket. I hung the laundry on the line in the morning and it dried by noon, which always gave me a disproportionate satisfaction, and then I brought it in and folded it at the kitchen table while Tom napped and Margaret sat with her books. The radio was on. Something unimportant was playing, and I had a moment, a complete, full, inexplicable moment of understanding that I was happy, that this was a good life. Not the life I might have imagined in abstract at 19 with its possible dramas and adventures, but a real life, specific and located and mine, and in it I was happy. I want to tell you that I held on to that moment, that I was wise enough to recognize it fully in the moment of its happening, but I wasn't quite. I recognized it, noted it, felt grateful, and then went back to the laundry. It was only later, years later, that I understood those ordinary Tuesday afternoons as what they were, the substance of a life, as real and as precious as anything more obviously remarkable. Miss Garfield had told me that every name on a page was once a person who woke up in the morning with something they needed to do that day. I think what she was trying to tell me was that the needing to do things, and the doing of them, was itself the life. That there was no other life hiding behind the ordinary one, waiting for the ordinary one to finish. The women transported to Australia, I think about the ones who stayed, who served their sentences and were freed and chose to remain, who married in that new country and had children who had children. They were building ordinary lives in a place that had received them as criminals and then released them as persons. And the building of those ordinary lives, the Tuesday afternoons of them, the laundry lines and the kitchens and the children's noise, was the same thing I was doing in Millbrook, Ohio, even though the landscapes were entirely different and the circumstances of how we got there could not have been more unlike. The substance is the same, the getting up and the doing the day's things and the going to bed and doing it again. That is what it is to have a life. It does not require any particular drama to be real. Harold was a good father in the way that men of his time and temperament were good fathers, present when he was home, engaged with the children in the hours that were available, clear about what he expected from them without being harsh about it. He took Tom fishing on Saturday mornings when Tom was old enough, and Tom was bored by fishing, but liked the mornings themselves and liked being with his father in a way that fishing was the occasion for. He read to Margaret in the evenings, her choosing the books, and she chose well. She always had good taste. And I would hear them from the kitchen, Harold's voice reading and Margaret asking questions between the sentences that she could have answered herself but wanted to discuss with someone. Those evenings had a particular quality of rightness, of things being arranged in a way that was as good as it could be. I should say here, because someone reminded me that these evenings of mine are on Spotify as well, in case you'd like to have them that way. The link is in the description below, but I want to stay in 1959 for one more moment, in the kitchen on Maple Street, with the laundry folded on the table and the October light coming in the window and the radio playing something inconsequential. It is enough. I want you to know that it was enough. The neighbors, the dinners, the school meetings, the church Sundays, all of it adding up into a life that I did not examine much because it didn't require examination, because it was full in the way that keeps you occupied without requiring you to ask whether you are occupied correctly. That would come later. The asking would come later. In 1959, I was 28 years old, and the life I was living was the life I had more or less planned, and it was good, and the goodness of it was something I experienced rather than analyzed, which is perhaps the only way to fully experience a good thing. If you're still with me, I'm glad. Let yourself drift if you need to. I'll still be here keeping the lamp on when you're ready to come back. Let the children be asleep now, in their rooms down the hall. Let Harold be asleep beside me. Let the house be quiet in the particular way a house is quiet when everyone in it is resting and everything is as it should be. That's where we are. The year is something in the late 1950s, and the world is, for the moment, mostly all right. Sleep if you'd like. I'll keep the story warm for you. The 1960s began in our house the way decades mostly begin, without announcement, continuous with the thing that came before it, distinguishable mainly in retrospect. Margaret was 6 in 1960, Tom was 3, and the immediate texture of daily life had not changed very much from the last years of the 1950s. But something was different in the air outside our house, in the news on the radio and then on the television, a quality of tension and possibility that had not quite been there in the same way before, as if the country were in the process of deciding something about itself that it had been putting off for a long time. I watched the civil rights movement from the kitchen television in the early 1960s, as most white women in Ohio watched it from a distance, with a varying mixture of sympathy, confusion, and something I have to be honest and call the specific inertia of a person whose own life does not require her to act. I was not indifferent to what I was seeing. The dogs and the water hoses and the people on the bridge, I was not indifferent to any of it. But I was in Millbrook, Ohio, and my life was on Maple Street, and the gap between what I was watching and what I was able to do about it was very wide and very convenient, and I occupied that gap as most people occupy convenient gaps, with discomfort but without movement. I am not proud of this. It is simply true. My daughter Margaret, who was 11 and 12 and 13 in those years, watched alongside me and had questions I did not answer well. She had the quality that some children have of asking the obvious question in a way that makes clear it is not obvious at all, of pointing at what everyone can see and asking why. I did my best. I talked about history and injustice and the long arc of things, and she listened, and then she said, "But why didn't people do something sooner?" And I did not have a good answer for that. I still don't. The best I have managed in all the years since is that most people do not do things until the cost of not doing them becomes higher than the cost of doing them, and that the calculation of those costs is almost never fair and almost never equally distributed. The women's movement, when it arrived in its more explicit form in the late 1960s and into the 1970s, was something I watched with more direct personal interest and also, I have to say, more complicated feelings. The young women I saw on the television, marching and speaking and burning the things they were burning, I recognized something in them, a frustration with the structures I had been living inside for 20 years. I recognized it because I had felt versions of it myself in small and unacknowledged ways. The frustration of having an opinion that was not always taken seriously. The frustration of being the person who was assumed to be available for whatever task was inconvenient. The frustration of being competent in ways that were not rewarded or even much noticed because they were the expected baseline of being a woman. But I was also, and I want to be honest about this because selective honesty is not really honesty, I was also someone who had built a good life inside those structures, and who was therefore somewhat invested in not having the structures entirely dismantled. I am not saying the structures were good. I am saying that the human being who lives inside a set of arrangements, even arrangements that are not ideal, develops attachments to those arrangements that are complicated to acknowledge and complicated to give up. I was 40 years old when the women's movement was at its most visible, and I was not ready to say that the choices I had made were wrong, even as I was coming to understand that they had been, in some sense, the only choices I had been given. Harold and I talked about it. This is something I want to say clearly because I think it matters. Harold was not a man who dismissed what was happening in the women's movement. He was not entirely comfortable with it either, but he was not dismissive. He thought about things. He asked me what I thought rather than telling me what to think. He read the articles I left on the kitchen table and occasionally said, or, "That's interesting," or, "Well, I can see that," which was Harold's register for genuine engagement. He was not always right. He held on to certain assumptions longer than he should have. But he was trying, and the trying was genuine. And it made our marriage, in those years of the world changing, something that changed too, rather than something that simply endured. Margaret went to Ohio State in 1972, which was not a thing women had done very much in my family up to that point, but which felt, by 1972, like the most natural thing in the world, in a way that required some of the changes of the previous decade to feel natural. She studied history. Of course she did. She had been her mother's daughter in that specific way from the beginning, wanting to know what had happened and why and who had been forgotten in the telling of it. She went to Ohio State and then to graduate school, which was less expected, and wrote her dissertation on something that I was proud to understand when she described it, and that I could not reliably explain to anyone else. She is a professor now. She has her father's steadiness and my stubbornness, and the combination has served her well. Tom took a different path, as he always did everything, quickly and at an angle to the direction you expected. He went to work in construction after 2 years of college that he left without completing, and he built things, which was what he had always wanted to do, and he was good at it, and he has been good at it now for 40 years, and I think he made the right choice for himself, even though the choice was harder for me to accept than Margaret's was. I wanted certain things for my children that turned out not to be what my children wanted for themselves, and the learning to distinguish between those two sets of wants is one of the actual educations of parenthood. In Australia, in those same years of the 1960s and 1970s, something else was happening that I found out about much later. Australia was beginning to reckon with its convict history in a new and more complicated way. For most of the country's existence up to that point, the convict past had been something many Australians preferred not to discuss. The convict stain, as it was called, a mark of shame on the national story that polite people tended to step around. But in those decades, attitudes began to shift. Genealogists started looking into the records. Historians started writing about the transported women and men not as criminals to be ashamed of, but as people who had been part of an extraordinary and difficult founding. Families who had convict ancestors began to speak of it openly, and some of them began to speak of it with something approaching pride. I found this out in stages, in the years when I was beginning to return to the history I'd first read about in that library in Millbrook at the age of 10, coming back to it with more time and more library access, and more of the particular interest that grows in a person who has not let go of something for 40 years. I found histories written by Australian scholars, careful and detailed, that reconstructed the lives of the transported women from the records that remained. I found databases of names. I found the stories of specific women, not just Anne Meredith, but dozens of others, each one a particular life that had been partially preserved in the official record and partially constructed by patient historians who understood that a woman was more than her crime and her measurements. Mary Wade was the name I remember most from those readings. She was transported at the age of 11 in 1789 for stealing a dress from another child. 11 years old. She went to Australia in the Second Fleet, a small girl on a very large ship, and she survived the voyage, and she survived the colony, and she worked out her sentence, and she eventually married, and she had 21 children, her descendants, and this is the fact that has never stopped astonishing me. Her living descendants now number in the tens of thousands. They are ordinary Australians, living ordinary lives, and one of them traces back to an 11-year-old girl on a convict ship in 1789 who had everything taken from her and gave everything she had left. I told Harold about Mary Wade one evening in the early 1970s, reading from the book I had found, and he sat and listened to the whole thing, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "She must have been someone, that woman." He meant it as the highest possible compliment, and it was. She must have been someone. She was. I think about her on particular days when things are hard, or when I am feeling the resistance of circumstances, or when I am tempted to feel that what a person can do is limited by what has been done to them. Mary Wade would find that argument unpersuasive. Her life is the argument against it. The 1970s in our house were a quieter version of the general upheaval. Harold stable at the mill, Tom building his path, Margaret at school, and then beyond school, Harold's mother in her last years, and then gone, my own mother in her last years, the world visibly shifting around the stable centre of our life together. I took a part-time job at the county library in 1971, which was a thing that felt small and was in fact significant. I had not been employed outside the house since before Margaret was born, which was 17 years. Walking into the library on that first morning and sitting down behind the circulation desk and having my own hours and my own tasks and a paycheck with my own name on it, it was small, as I said, and it was everything. Harold approved. More than approved, he was genuinely pleased in the way he expressed pleasure, which was quietly and specifically. He said, "That seems right for you." It was 4 words. It was entirely sufficient. We reorganized the household around my hours without much drama, dividing the tasks that had been mine alone in ways that turned out to be less difficult than the cultural messaging of the previous 20 years had suggested they would be. Harold could make supper. He was not inspired at it, but he was capable. Tom, who was 14 and large and capable of managing his own laundry, managed his own laundry. Margaret came home from college during breaks and helped without being asked, because she had absorbed something of her grandmother's and her mother's matter-of-fact approach to necessary work. The years from about 1960 to about 1975 were the years when I did most of my active growing as a person. The growing that involves changing your mind about things, which is harder than any other kind and which cannot really be done when you are very young, because you need to have held a position long enough to understand it thoroughly before you can accurately understand why it was wrong. I grew into a different understanding of what women's lives contained and could contain. I grew into a different understanding of history, of whose stories get told and whose get lost and why. I grew into a different understanding of my own marriage, which was better than I had known how to see when I was inside its early years. And I grew, steadily and without announcement, into the person I was going to be for the rest of my life. Let the decade change, gently. Let the light on the kitchen table shift from one kind of afternoon to another. The children are older. The house is the same. Harold and I have been married long enough now that we move around each other without thinking about it, the way you move around familiar furniture in the dark. Something is coming that I haven't gotten to yet, and I want to let it come slowly, the way most things that are coming slowly come, without hurry, without announcement, just arriving, eventually, into the space that was always waiting for it. Harold was diagnosed in 1983 in February, which is a month I've never quite forgiven for the coincidence, though I know it wasn't the month's fault. We were at the doctor's office together, which we were in the habit of being since neither of us was very good at receiving difficult information without the other present, and the doctor, a young man who was very thorough and very kind, told us what the tests had shown, and Harold and I sat in the small beige room and listened, and Harold asked several careful and specific questions, and the doctor answered them. And then we thanked him, and we went out to the car, and we sat in the parking lot for a long time without starting the engine. The snow was coming down outside. Harold's hand found mine on the seat between us. That is the whole of that scene, and it is sufficient. The disease was Parkinson's, which most people have heard of, and which even then, in the early 1980s, had a reasonably well-understood course. What most people do not know before it arrives in their own house is the particular quality of its progress, the way it is slow and then slower, and the way the slowness is itself a kind of sustained difficulty, because everything that has to be done still has to be done, only more carefully, and with more help, and then with more help than that, and then more. Harold managed it with the steadiness that was his fundamental characteristic. He retired from the mill in 1985, earlier than he had planned, and we reorganized our days around the new requirements, the way we had always reorganized when something required it. I want to say something about caring for a sick person that I have not seen said accurately in most of the accounts I have read, which tend toward either the heroic or the tragic. What I found in the years of caring for Harold was that it was both harder and easier than I had expected. Harder in the obvious physical ways, easier in ways I had not anticipated. Easier because when you are doing something necessary, you do not have much space to spend on wondering whether you should be doing something else. The necessity clarifies. You are here, this is what is needed, you do it. There is something, I do not want to call it peace, because peace is not quite the right word, something settling in that. A kind of reduction to the essential. I kept my job at the library until 1987, when I reduced my hours, and then I left it altogether in 1989, when Harold needed more than the hours between my shifts could provide. I did not feel this as sacrifice, and I want to be clear about that, because I know that from the outside it can look like the old story, the woman once again reorganizing herself around the needs of a man. It was not that. Harold did not ask me to leave. I chose to, as I had chosen most of the important things in my life, not because there was no other option, but because among the options available to me, this was the one I preferred. I wanted to be there. I had always wanted to be there. The wanting was genuine and particular and did not require anyone's permission. Margaret came when she could, which was often, and Tom came when he could, which was regular if less frequent, and Harold's brother drove up from Cincinnati several times a year. The children were good about it. They were present in a way that I found, and this surprised me a little, more useful than I had expected presents to be. I had thought I would manage better alone, which is a version of the same mistake I had been making my entire adult life, the assumption that needing help was an imposition rather than an exchange. Margaret and Tom showing up, making supper, sitting with their father in the evenings and watching whatever was on, it was not an imposition for anyone. It was what the arrangement required and what the love provided, and those two things in the best circumstances are the same. Harold died in 1991, in the autumn. He had been ill for 8 years by then and had managed them, as he managed everything, with a steadiness that I think he had to work harder and harder to maintain as the years went on, and that I think cost him something I never fully saw the cost of. He died at home, which was what he wanted, in the bedroom where we had slept for 30 years, with the morning light coming in through the window the way it always had. I was there. The children were there. It was quiet. It was as it should have been, to the extent that anything so fundamentally wrong can be as it should be. I am not going to tell you the grief was simple. It was not. But I will tell you something about grief that I found to be true, which is that it is not what you expect. What you expect, or what I expected, was a period of intense pain followed by a gradual recovery, the way a physical wound heals. What actually happens, or what happened to me, is more like a permanent rearrangement of the interior furniture of your life. The grief does not leave. It becomes familiar. It becomes eventually something you carry the way you carry your history, not as an active wound, but as a part of what you are, a weight that is present without being always in the front of your awareness, that you notice most when you do something for the first time without him, or when something happens that you would have told him. I found in those first months and then years that the specific texture of grief is made up of very particular things, not the large absences, the empty chair, the quiet house, though those were real, the particular things, the fact that there was no one to check the weather forecast with before making plans. The fact that the grocery list had changed permanently to account for one person instead of two, and that the adjustment of that list, the first time I made it after the funeral, was one of the harder moments of that whole difficult time. The fact that the sound of the house in the evening was different in a way that had nothing to do with any actual sound, but was a quality of the silence, which was now the silence of one person rather than two. Grief is very specific, it is the details that hold it. I thought often, in those first years after Harold, about the transported women who had been separated from the people they loved. I thought about the woman who was a nuisance to her husband, and I wondered, with a new kind of curiosity, what she made of the separation once she was in Australia and he was not. Had she grieved him? Had she been glad of the distance? Had she, in the new country, met someone else, started something new, found that the distance was not only loss, but also a strange and unexpected kind of space? The records do not tell us. The records rarely tell us the interior of a life. They tell us dates and sentences and occupations and the external facts of transactions. What a woman felt on any given morning is not generally in the record. Ruth came to stay with me for 2 weeks after Harold died, driving up from Columbus where she had been living since her own retirement. She was my sister, and she did what sisters do in those circumstances. She slept in the guest room and made coffee in the morning and sat with me in the evenings and talked about Harold, about our parents, about the things we had shared and the people who were gone now, letting me talk for as long as I needed to and being quiet when I was quiet. She had lost her own husband 5 years before. She knew the specific shape of it. We talked about that too, without drama, in the late evenings when the house was as quiet as it was going to get. It helped, that talking. I did not know it would help as much as it did until it had helped. Grief benefits enormously from company. I was 60 years old when Harold died, and it is a particular age to become newly alone, old enough that the aloneness has a permanent quality it might not have had at 40, young enough that the years ahead are not a brief remainder but a substantial portion of a life. I was in good health. I had the library job to which I returned after a few months. I had Margaret and Tom and eventually their children. I had the house on Maple Street which was mine and which I knew. I had, in other words, what you need to keep going, not happiness, not immediately, but the infrastructure of a life within which happiness eventually is possible. I kept the radio on in those years, even when I was not particularly listening. The sound of voices in the house was a comfort that I did not think needed justification. I turned it on in the morning when I made coffee and left it going until I went to bed, and it asked nothing of me and provided the basic human gift of not being alone with complete silence. I had my books. I had my correspondence with Margaret, who has always written letters, real letters, on paper, the way some people write emails, frequently and with genuine content. I had the garden, which Harold had always helped with and which I now did alone, which required a reorganization of the tasks, but which was still my garden and still responsive to attention. The grandchildren began arriving in those years, Margaret's daughter in 1988, Tom's 2 boys in 1990 and 1993, and their arrival changed the texture of things in the way that grandchildren do, which is to introduce into the household a kind of energy that is not yours, but that you are glad to receive on loan. My granddaughter Claire is the one I am closest to, perhaps because she has Margaret's seriousness and her grandmother's interest in old things and what they mean, and we have spent many afternoons over the years at the kitchen table with books between us, which is its own kind of happiness. How you carry it. I want to answer the question I set as this chapter's subject, because I am aware I have circled it without quite landing on it. How you carry grief, how you carry loss, how you carry the parts of your life that are over and the people who were in them. I think the honest answer is that you carry it the way you carry everything else that is heavy, by setting it down regularly, resting, and picking it back up. You do not hold it at arm's length, that is too exhausting to sustain. You do not immerse yourself in it to the exclusion of everything else, that is, in the long run, a refusal of the life that remains. You carry it close inside the ordinary days, and the ordinary days become gradually bearable, and then adequate, and then, this part always surprises me, genuinely good. The transported women carried losses I cannot fully imagine. They lost their families, their places, their freedom, sometimes their children. They carried those losses across an ocean and into a country that did not welcome them, and they kept going. The ones who kept going, who built something in that difficult ground, they are the ones the records let us see, not because they were exceptional, but because their continuing left traces. The ones who did not keep going, who collapsed under the weight, their stories are shorter in the record. I do not judge them. I simply think about the ones who kept going, and I am grateful for them, and I carry their names when I carry the other heavy things. The house is quiet now. The rain has found its late-night rhythm. Let the losses rest a moment. Let Harold be remembered gently, the way I think of him most nights, which is without the grief at the front of it, and with the love at the front of it, which is where, after enough years, the love eventually settles. He was a good man. He was steady. He paid attention. Those things outlast. The quiet years, which is what I call the decade or so after Harold died and before old age began to make its own distinct requirements, were the years in which I understood most of what I understand. I have read in books and magazines that old age brings wisdom, and I have always thought this is both true and somewhat misleading. The wisdom is not given, it has to be worked for, and most of the working involves being willing to look at things you spent a great deal of your life not quite looking at directly. The aloneness helped. Not because aloneness is inherently clarifying, it isn't, it can just as easily be diminishing, but because the structure of my life in those years gave me, for the first time, a great deal of time in which the only person whose needs I was managing was my own. I spent a great deal of that time reading. This is not surprising. I had been reading all my life, whenever the life's other business permitted, but I read differently in those years, more slowly, more willingly to stop on a sentence and sit with it, more willing to put a book down partway through and go for a walk and come back and reread the same passage with the walk inside me, and find that the passage had changed or that I had. I read the historians of women's lives, the biographies of women who had been notable in ways that history did not always find worth noting. I read the Australian historians who had spent careers reconstructing the lives of the transported women. I went back to the subjects I had first encountered at 10 years old, at Miss Garfield's suggestion, in the county library in Millbrook, and I found them richer than they had been at 10, which is what happens when you bring more of yourself to a subject. What I came to understand reading in those quiet years was that the history of women's lives is largely the history of things that did not make it into the record, the things that were done but not noted, the competencies that were assumed rather than praised, the decisions that were made but not attributed. When I read the indent documents of the transported women, those official lists of their heights and eye colours and trades, what I am reading is the residue of lives that the record was never designed to capture. The record was designed for administrative purposes, to track convicts through a system, and it does that. It does not track what the women cooked or what they laughed at or how they felt about the ocean crossing or what they thought of Australia when they first saw it. Those things are simply not there. I spent time in those quiet years trying to think about the freedom question, what freedom meant and what it had meant in my own life, and how that compared to what it had meant or failed to mean in the lives of the women I had been reading about for decades. I had been free, in a legal and formal sense, all my life. I had been born in the United States in the 20th century to parents who were not wealthy but who were stable, and I had grown up in a place where the law did not threaten me in the way it had threatened Anne Meredith or any of the others. This is not a small thing, it is in fact an enormous thing, and I have tried not to treat it as given in the years since I understood it clearly. And yet, the freedom that is legally available and the freedom that is actually available are not always identical, and I had spent much of my life in the gap between them. Not unhappily, I want to say that again, because I am always afraid of sounding as if I am making a complaint where I mean to make an observation. The life I lived was the life I wanted, largely. But the range of lives available to me had been shaped by forces that had nothing to do with my individual preferences, and the shaping had been so thorough and so early that for a long time I could not see it as shaping. I took it for the natural shape of things. It was only in the quiet years, with the time to look and the willingness to look, that I could see where the natural shape of things ended and the shape that had been made for me began. The transported women had, in the most obvious and undeniable way, no freedom. They were property of the Crown, assigned to work, overseen, subject to punishment for infractions, bound to a sentence and a location, and a set of requirements that left very little of their lives in their own management. And yet, and this is the thing I keep coming back to, the records show women who found ways. Women who formed friendships in the female factories. Women who negotiated better assignments. Women who saved their ticket of leave wages. Women who, in the most difficult circumstances the 19th century could arrange, maintained some version of themselves that was not entirely defined by the category the law had put them in. I do not want to romanticize this. The circumstances were brutal and the freedom that existed within them was minimal, but it was there, and it was exercised, and it cost something, and it matters. I think of Mary Wade often, the 11-year-old girl from 1789. She had been stripped of everything that could be stripped: her home, her country, her freedom, her family. She had been sent to the end of the world for stealing a dress. And she had married and raised 21 children and lived to be nearly 80 years old. And the number of her living descendants, as of recent counts, exceeds 80,000 people. I am not saying her story is a triumph. It is too complicated and too costly to be simple triumph. I am saying that she persisted, and that her persistence had consequences that reached forward through time in ways she could not have imagined, and that the reaching forward was an act of something, a quality of being human that I find worth honouring even when the circumstances around it were not honourable. What I understand now that I did not understand at 30 or 40 or even 50 is that the ordinary is where most things happen. Not the dramatic moments. Those are real and they leave marks. But the Tuesday afternoons and the Friday baking and the months of steady, careful management that do not appear in anyone's biography. Most of a life is ordinary, and the quality of the ordinary is what determines the quality of the life. I spent too many years treating the ordinary as the space between significant events, the passage to be gotten through on the way to the meaningful thing. I understand now that the ordinary is the meaningful thing. The tending of the ordinary is the whole work. My granddaughter Claire, who is in her 30s now and who calls me every Sunday without fail, which is a habit she picked up from her mother and that I receive as the specific gift it is, asked me once what I thought the most important thing I had learned was. She asked it with the directness that young women have now, which I find admirable and which I also find a little daunting because it expects a direct answer, and I am old enough to know that most important things do not resolve into a single sentence. But I tried. I said, I think the most important thing I have learned is that the people who are forgotten by history are not less than the people who are remembered by it. They are usually just unluckier in their documentation, and that knowing they existed, that trying to know they existed, matters. She thought about this for a moment, and then she said, "Is that why you've been reading about those Australian women your whole life?" And I said, "Yes, I think so. I think I have been reading about them because they were real and because the record almost lost them and because I did not want to be a person who did not try to find them." She nodded in the way she nods when she is filing something away rather than responding to it, and the conversation moved on. But later that afternoon, doing the washing up alone in the kitchen, I thought, yes, that is exactly why. The library in Millbrook changed enormously over the years I worked there, and I worked there longer than I thought I would. 22 years in total, part-time, which turned out to be the right proportion of working life for the stage of life I was in. The card catalogue became a computer database. The shelves expanded and reorganized. The patrons changed. More children, more retirees, fewer working adults with time to browse. But the essential transaction did not change. A person comes in wanting something they don't quite know how to ask for, and you help them find it. That transaction is ancient. And it is good, and I was glad to be part of it for as long as I was. What I understand about women now, after 90-some years of being one and reading about them, is that the category is too large for any general statement to fit it well. Women are not a type. They are a statistical group with a shared set of structural experiences, the biological facts, the legal and social arrangements that follow from those facts. And within that group, there is as much variation as there is within any other grouping of human beings. And Meredith and I are both women. We share that, and perhaps something of the experiences that flowed from it, and beyond that, we are individuals who were shaped by particular circumstances into particular people. That particularity is the thing I have been reaching for my whole reading life. The individual inside the category, the specific person inside the historical type. And the specific people inside the historical type were, I have come to believe, more varied and more interesting and more resilient and more funny and more ordinary and more extraordinary than the record makes them seem. The record flattens, it reduces, it puts a woman on a page as a height and a hair colour and a sentence, and what it cannot convey is the weight of her in a room, the quality of her laugh, the particular intelligence she brought to the specific problem of surviving in the specific circumstances she was given. That intelligence was there. It had to have been there because the surviving is there in the record, even if the intelligence that made it possible is not. I sit here in my 80s and I think, I have had a long time, and I have used it. I have not always used it well. I have been wrong about things and stubborn about things and slow to understand things that were in front of me. I have missed opportunities I did not know were opportunities and taken some that turned out to be different from what they appeared. I have loved people well, mostly. I have been loved, better than I sometimes deserved. I have read enough to know how much I have not read, and I have carried, for most of my life, a collection of women's names from another century and another continent, and I have thought about them on the ordinary Tuesdays that make up a life, and I am glad I did. Let the quiet years continue a little. Let the kitchen be what it is on a late evening, clean, familiar, lit by the lamp, smelling of tea and the particular settled smell of a house that has been lived in thoughtfully for a long time. Everything is as it should be, almost everything. There is one more evening I want to tell you about, and it is this one, tonight, the one we are in right now. I am in my armchair, which has a dent in the left armrest where my elbow goes. I have been making that dent for perhaps 15 years, and it is now exactly the right shape for my elbow, which means the chair and I have arrived at an arrangement that suits us both. The lamp beside it throws a warm circle of light that reaches the bookshelf on one side and the window on the other, and leaves everything beyond that circle in a dim that is comfortable rather than dark. The rain on the roof is what I described to you at the beginning, light, steady, the kind that has found its rhythm and will keep it until morning. I am an old woman, and this is a quiet house, and the night outside is doing its slow, ordinary work of turning toward morning. I have a book on my lap that I have not been reading. I opened it after supper with good intentions and read perhaps a page, and then I began to think the way I think in the evenings, not in ordered argument, but in the associative drift that old age seems to facilitate, one thing leading to another without demanding justification for the connection. I thought about the women I have been carrying for 80 years, the ones on the ships, the ones in the records, the ones whose names I have found in the careful work of historians who understood that the names were worth finding. And I thought about you, whoever you are, the one listening to this tonight, wherever you are, and I thought that I would like to talk to you about them one more time before the evening is over. The transported women's descendants. Let me tell you what became of them in the aggregate, in the large and hopeful shape of it. The women who were sent to Australia in those 80 years of transportation between 1788 and 1868, most of them stayed. They served their sentences, and they did not have the resources to go back, and some of them had built enough in Australia that going back was no longer the point. They married, many of them, and they had children who were born in Australia and who grew up as Australians with no memory of England and no sense of being in the wrong place. And those children had children, and those children had more children. And the thing that was done to those original women, the forced removal, the sentence, the transportation, became, over generations, the root system of a country. Australia today has roughly 25 million people. A substantial portion of those people, by the best estimates of the genealogists who have spent careers working these numbers out, are descended from the convicts who were transported between 1788 and 1868, not from criminals, as the old shameful framing would have it, but from people, ordinary, particular, frightened, resourceful people, who were put on ships and sent away and who kept going when keeping going was the only option. The convict stain that Australia spent so long being ashamed of is now, for many Australians, a point of pride. People search for their convict ancestors in the databases. They find their Anne Merediths, their Mary Wades, their particular women with their specific measurements and their listed crimes and their long sentences. They find them and they claim them, which is the right and proper response. I find this beautiful. I have always found it beautiful, not in a sentimental way, not in a way that denies the suffering, but in the way that beauty attaches itself to resilience, to the fact of a person or a people continuing when continuation required everything they had. The women on the ships did not know what they were beginning. They were in the hold, or on the deck in the cold, 8 months from a country they would not see again. They were not thinking about their descendants, they were thinking about the next hour, the next day, the next thing they had to get through. But the getting through had consequences that moved forward through time in the way that all things move forward through time, and those consequences are now 25 million ordinary people living ordinary lives in Australia, most of them entirely unaware that somewhere in their lineage there is a woman with a government record and a listed crime and a name that survived because someone wrote it down. I have a granddaughter named Claire, who I have mentioned, and who has my nose and her mother's brains and a disposition toward history that I suspect I am at least partially responsible for. She called me last Sunday, as she does every Sunday, and she told me that she had been looking into the Australian records because she had listened to me talk about them for most of her life and had finally decided to look for herself. She found a database. She found the indent records. She spent an evening reading the entries, the heights, the eye colours, the listed crimes, and she called me afterward and said, "Grandma, they're so specific. They're so particular. I can see them." I said, "Yes, that's it. That's the whole of it." She could see them. They had not been entirely lost. What I want to say about this evening, about tonight specifically, the rain on this particular roof, the lamp in this particular circle of light, is that it is enough. It is not what I would have designed for myself at 19, when I had a 19-year-old's ideas about what a life should look like. It is richer than that, and stranger, and more specific. It contains more loss than I would have chosen and more ordinary joy than I knew to want. It contains Harold, who is not here and who is always here. It contains my children and their children, and the particular pleasure of watching people you love become themselves in ways you could not have predicted. It contains 80 years of reading and the accumulated companionship of all the people I have found in books, the Anne Merediths, the Mary Wades, the women without names in the records, the women whose names are there if you look. I want to say something about what you have given me by listening. The arrangement of this, whatever this is, me talking and you somewhere at the other end of it, in your bed or your chair, with the night around you, it is its own kind of company. I've been alone in this house for many years now, and I have been more or less at peace with that, but the aloneness has its quality, its specific weight, and the knowing that someone is there, that my talking is being received somewhere, that matters to me. You are a stranger. You may have come here entirely accidentally looking for something to fall asleep to, and you have given me, without knowing it, the gift of an audience, which is to say the gift of mattering. Thank you for that, quietly. And I should mention, these evenings of mine, the whole library of them, are on Spotify as well, for whenever you'd like them that way. The link is in the description. I think of it as another way of keeping the lamp on. The things in this room. I have been in this house for 50 years, and the things in it are the archaeology of a life, each one a specific origin, a specific memory attached. The blue picture on the windowsill that was my mother's. The photograph of Harold and me in the summer of 1965 outside the house on Maple Street, squinting into the sun and grinning in a way that I find slightly embarrassing and very dear. The quilt on the back of the couch, that is not my grandmother's quilt, that one did not survive. But that was made by a woman in the church quilting group in a pattern that is different but serves the same purpose. The books, everywhere, in the state of mild disorder that books achieve when someone has been reading them seriously for decades and has not prioritized aesthetic arrangement over convenient access. The window across the room shows me nothing but my own reflection and the dark beyond it. The rain is still there, beyond the glass, doing its quiet work. I think of all the windows I have sat beside over a long life, the one in my parents' kitchen, the frost patterns on the inside glass, the letters I wrote there with my finger, the window in the house on Maple Street, the one I painted the kitchen to preserve, the hospital windows, the ones I looked out of when Harold was ill and when I needed a moment that was different from the room. Windows are where I go when I need to be inside and outside at the same time, which is something I need fairly often. I think the women on the ships looked at the water the way I look at windows. You cannot see through it to what you want, but you can look at it. And looking is something. It is the action available when the action you want is not. I think they looked at the ocean and they thought about the people they were leaving. And then, after long enough, they looked at it and they thought about what was ahead. The new country, the strange trees, the reversed seasons, the life that would have to be made from whatever was there to make it from. That shift, from looking back to looking forward, is not a simple shift, and it is not a shift you make once and then keep. You make it, and then you unmake it, and you make it again, many times, over the years, and each time it requires the same effort it required the first time. What I know about women's lives after 90-some years of living one and many decades of reading about others, they are largely made of the making it again, the steady getting up and beginning, the particular competence of returning to what needs doing after the thing that required everything. The Tuesday afternoon after the hard week. The bread baked again on Friday when last Friday's bread was the bread of a difficult day. That returning is not passive. It is an act, and it has a kind of courage, and it is performed mostly in private by people who would not think to call it courage. Anne Meredith baked bread in Australia, I am almost certain of it. Mary Wade baked bread in Australia and raised 21 children to be people who baked bread after her. The bread and the baking and the Tuesday afternoons, that is where the living is. That is what has always been where the living is. So, I am here in my armchair with the dent in the armrest, and the lamp is on, and the rain on the roof is exactly what a rain at this hour should be, and I am an old woman with a long life behind her and a still good evening ahead of her. I am going to let you sleep if you need to. I will sit here a little while longer with the lamp. There is nowhere else I need to be. Sleep well, dear. Come back whenever the night feels long. The rain on the roof. Let that be enough for a while. Just the rain on the roof, which is not demanding anything of you, which is simply doing what rain does in the quiet hours, falling softly with the patient indifference of weather that has nowhere to be and no particular hurry about any of it. The lamp is still on. I said I would keep it on, and I have. The circle of light is warm and very still, and everything outside the circle is a comfortable dark, the kind of dark that a room is at this hour when everything in it is familiar and nothing in it is a threat. You know this room, or you know a room like it. You know the sounds a house makes when it settles. You know the particular quality of being horizontal and covered and warm, which is one of the oldest and most reliable pleasures available to a human being, and you are in it now. Let your breathing slow. It is already slowing. You do not have to do anything for that to happen. The body knows what to do in the dark, in the warmth, when someone is keeping watch. Let it know. Let the breath come in slowly and go out slowly, and let the space between the out-breath and the in-breath be a little wider than it was a moment ago. That space is where sleep comes from. It is already widening. I am still here. I am not going anywhere. The lamp is on and the rain is on the roof, and I am sitting in my chair with the dent in the armrest, and I am thinking about all the ordinary women who kept going, the ones in Ohio, the ones in Australia, the ones everywhere that history forgot to look for. And I am thinking that keeping going is the whole of it really, and that you are doing it right now, in the particular way that lying down and breathing and letting go is a form of keeping going. The names. Let them settle into you like the rain settles into the ground. Eleanor, born 1931, Anne Meredith, transported 1826, Mary Wade, transported 1789, who lived to be old, who had 21 children, who is the ancestor of tens of thousands of people who are sleeping tonight without knowing she is in them. All the unnamed women in all the records, with their grey eyes and their brown hair and their listed crimes and their sentences served and their lives continued. They are sleeping too, in the way that people who have finished with sleeping sleep, and they are not troubled, and they did not ask for anything except the thing you are doing right now, which is to let them be remembered, which is to let them matter, which is to carry them gently into the night. The rain on the roof, the lamp, the warm dark, the in-breath and the out-breath, and the widening space between them where sleep lives. You are almost there. You have been almost there for a while now. Let the almost become the actual. Let the thinking stop, gently, the way a stream stops in winter. Not all at once, but gradually, the flow slowing and quieting until it is very nearly still. I will be here when you wake up, or I will be here again another night, which is the same thing in the way that I mean it. The lamp will be on. There will be more to tell. There is always more to tell in a long life, and I will tell it at this same unhurried pace, in this same quiet, for as long as you would like to listen. Sleep well. You are safe. The house is warm. The rain is doing what rain does. Somewhere on the other side of the world, a country built partly by women who had everything taken from them is waking into a new morning, and it is ordinary and sufficient and good. And here it is night, and the night is exactly what it should be. If you'd like, tell me where in the world you're listening from and what the night is like there. I do wonder about that, and if there's a part of a life you'd like to hear about next, a decade, a question, a particular kind of ordinary day, leave it for me. I'll be back next week with the lamp on, ready to begin.